Let's just talk about some of the challenges that East African bankers are facing, particularly at this time where we know that globally banks are under pressure, first of all, because of obviously the overlending that happened in the previous years. And secondly, the requirement to try and raise extra capital because of Basel III requirements. Is that an issue in your part of the world?
Oh, yes, it is. It's an issue in East Africa in particular, and more so in Kenya. But I think the challenges you have had in Kenya have been more linked to the recent increase in the interest rates in the market rather than the capital requirements.
So in terms of the money that the banks in Kenya have to raise, what sort of figures are we talking about here?
In terms of profitability?
No, in terms of the amounts of extra capital that banks will have to raise to meet the requirements of Basel III.
Yes. Okay, what has happened is that initially the banks were required to have a minimum core capital of 250 million shillings. This was raised to 1 billion shillings, which was meant to be built up over time so that by the end of this year, 2012, the banks were meant to have hit a minimum core capital of 1 billion. And most banks are working towards that, that objective. What has happened is that a number of banks have had to either merge or do some form of reorganization to be able to achieve that target of 1 billion shillings.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the market itself to be able to support the extra capital that is required, is that available, or will the country and some of the banks have to look outside?
A number of them may have to look outside, but a number of them are actually trying to source from the domestic sources, whereby they either reorganize and call in additional shareholders, or by one way or another raise the money from either the capital markets or alternative sources, but to be able to hit that target by 2012 December.
Any assistance from the government side?
Well, in terms of sourcing the capital, not quite. I mean, it's actually left to the individual banks to either consolidate or reorganize themselves, or in one way or another be able to raise the required capital, except possibly the government-owned or partly government-owned institutions. But fortunately, most of them are well within the required minimum capital requirement.
Yeah. Now, Africa, of course, isn't just about challenges like we're discussing now, but it's also about opportunity, and there's loads of it abounding, particularly when you look at some of the statistics suggesting that there are as many as 78% of the continent's people who are unbanked. In East Africa, are we beginning to see banks beginning to take advantage of this, and in what sort of area and in what sort of products are they offering? Yeah,
in East Africa, the challenge of the unbanked members of the community, first of all, unbanked and the underbanked members of the community is quite an issue. And so, speaking from the Kenyan perspective, we have really put at the forefront the issue of financial inclusion. So a number of initiatives have come up in the banking sector to ensure that our banking services reach the previously unbanked and underbanked members of the community. Things like agency banking, where banks are able to extend their services to the rural areas and the remote areas of the country without necessarily having to put up the significant infrastructure. That has been quite effective. Other distribution channels like mobile banking, the money transfer systems have really come in quite strongly. And in Kenya, I think you must be aware of the M-Pesa, which is quite effective in terms of money transfer.
Indeed, we do know about the M-Pesa system. But in terms of support from the government, and also in terms of what you need as bankers to be able to do what you need, what are some of the ideas that you think ought to be implemented to try and reform the banking sector so you're able to do your work more effectively, especially considering the issues around infrastructure challenges to reach the more remote parts of the continent?
One of them is the fact that the cost of doing business actually for the banking industry is pretty high. And I think the focus would be to working in close partnership with the government to ensure that those barriers to high cost are really brought down. For instance, a good example is the one we just mentioned earlier about the agency banking, where through facilitation by the central bank, this has been achieved where banks are able to reach the previously unbanked areas. But there are many other areas where the cost of putting up some of the infrastructure is not quite as expected. For instance, putting up a branch, initially we had specifications which was based on the previous model of a bank. But given what has happened and the technology-driven environment, the requirements for the kinds of specifications that are currently existing are no longer necessary. So maybe that's an area that can be looked at. Then banks can be able to put up branches countrywide that are much cheaper to put up than currently it is, because that's hindering a number of banks from putting up the branches.
Indeed. Habil Olaka, CEO of the Kenya Bankers Association, thank you for joining us live from our studios in Nairobi.